welcome to the Pageturner. Before this episode starts, I want to inform you that topics covered in this episode may be found disturbing or uncomfortable to some listeners. As such, viewer or rather listener discretion is advised. Additionally, if you or a loved one needs help, help is available by dialing 988 for the suicide hotline. You are not alone. Now sit back, grab a snack, and enjoy the episode. Alright, hi guys, welcome to the Pageturner. My name is Christina. Welcome to the very first episode. I am very excited but also very nervous for this. I guess this is to combat my fear of, being on camera and talking to people. And like I said, I'm very excited but I'm also very nervous. This is literally just a yap fest at this point because, as you may or may not know, this podcast is to shed light on horror literature because it is my favorite genre. And I just think horror literature is great because it's not afraid to be itself. And it just goes to lengths that you wouldn't expect. And I'm very excited to talk about it with you guys. And let's get started. So first, I would like to talk about my current read. We will probably do this for all the episodes. So I've actually read like 80 pages of this, but I haven't picked it up in like a week. Not a week. It's been over a week. But it is Mother Thing by Ainsley Hogarth. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It is a domestic horror novel, and it contains things about grief, suicide, and all of that. So the main plot, sorry, I have my computer over here. So we are following this couple, Abby and Ralph, yes. And so in the beginning of the book, Ralph's mother dies. She commits suicide, and we follow basically their grief in the beginning of the book. However, in the middle of the book, which I haven't gotten to, I only know this from the back of the blurb, it is basically, so her ghost comes back and begins haunting both Ralph and Abby. And so Abby has to devise a plan to save both of them from his mother. And this was pretty good in like the first few pages. I think just because I DNF'd it because I was like bed rotting. And also it was very slow in the beginning. I'm sure if you could power through, it's probably going to be very good. But like I've started tabbing like quotes, if you could see. Yay. Yeah, that's really it. For next cover, stunning. Hang it up in the blurb. I love it so much. It is also under 300 pages. Last time I checked, it was 279. And also, like I said, this does contain some sensitive themes, so be careful when picking this up. And with that, we will get to the main episode, which is about a history of horror literature. And so this video is actually very interesting to research. I learned a lot about this, and I'm very excited to share my findings with you. So my main informational source is from this book called, I believe, Horror Literature History, I think. But it's by Xavier Aldana Reyes, and he is the main contributor. There's a bunch of other contributors in the book. All this research that I'm saying is barely scratching the surface of the novel. There is a lot of topics to cover in the novel. So if you want a deeper dive, go ahead and pick it up. It is very in-depth. It is very good. So I guess let's get into it. So in the beginning of the book, Aldana Reyes first defines what horror literature and horror fiction is. And so he defines horror as narratives created in order to create shock, fear, disgust alongside other emotional states. And I quote from him, "Horror takes its name, in other words, from the effects that it seeks to elicit in its readers." And it definitely is effective. That's what horror is about. And there's so many subgenres that deal with different things and can elicit different reactions from the reader. And I think that's what makes it great. It doesn't happen like you don't feel it inside. It's just like you feel it on the outside as well, because some books make you paranoid, they make you scared, they make you wanting more. And the why behind this is horror is more than a genre, according to him, that is confined to, in quote, thematic concerns. I quote from him as well. For some, many of the academics who study the genre, horror is also a phobic cultural form that is a product of a given time in socio-cultural and psychological makeup that changes and molds according to shifts in power and historically contingent anxieties. This means that horror acts as a form of cathartic entertainment. It both probes our deepest fears and allowed us to fantasize about their dangers from the vantage point of fiction, which I definitely agree with. It definitely pulls in a lot of modern day fears and phobias from people and is not afraid to put those out there and scare people. It's almost like an indirect way of experiencing our fears, and I really do enjoy that. And it reflects not only our fears, but fears that can be, which is mainly like dystopian horror and that kind of stuff. And in our particular horror history, and in the particular horror history within the book, so the book begins discovering the Gothic era of horror literature in the 18th century. However, the genre is not fully recognized until the 20th century. And the 20th century also produced the most amount of horror text. So with that, let's get into period 1, which is the Gothic era, which was written by Dale Townshend, one of the contributors, and this mainly covers from 1740 to 1820. So in 1740, we see the emergence of what they call a horrible romance, with inattention to style and dependent upon prior publications. And he notes that mystery and horror are ingredients of the horrible romance, and it most strongly affected the uninstructed. And we mainly see the first Gothic horrible romance from Horace Walpole's 1764 publication of The Castle of Otranto. And like I said, it is considered the first Gothic story and the first horrible romance. I quote from Townshend that, not Townshend, I got this from like Britannica, but it was also really interesting searching it up. So it basically describes a series of strange happenings that take place in and around the Castle of Otranto in Italy, and it is described as being like journal entries during the darkest ages of Christianity. That is, in or around the period between 1095, which was the era of the First Crusade, and 1243, the date of the last. So this book basically takes place in between the Crusades. Like I said, it is presented as a found transcript, and the main plot summary is we follow Manfred. He basically arranges a marriage between his son Conrad and Princess Isabella. However, on the wedding day, Conrad's nowhere to be found, but he's later found out to be dead because a helmet smashed into his head. This literally gives Carrie when Tommy gets hit with the bucket and just dies. When I imagine it, I haven't read this book. It's a Spartan helmet. I imagine it being a Spartan helmet because what else would kill him? What else would kill him if it wasn't like a Spartan metal helmet? Anyways, when this happens, Manfred decides to marry Isabella. But when she refuses, he kidnaps her. But a series of supernatural events follows, and Isabella escapes, leading him to meeting her father. I don't want to give too much away, so I'm just going to leave it at that. So, Townshend also says, Walpole in The Castle of Otranto was more concerned with revivifying the prosaic term of the 18th century realist novel, with the imaginative capacities of medieval romance than in crafting what we would today describe as a, in quote, horror novel. Furthermore, crucial to literary renditions of horror, though it certainly was, Otranto, as the above synopsis suggests, looked back toward the older tradition of the Shakespearean supernatural for the staging of its most blood-curdling effects, which is quoting Hamlet, Macbeth, Scottish play, probably Curse's House, and Julius Caesar. Another defining piece was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and I actually have it on the bookshelf here. Yippee! This is the pretty cover that I got. It's so pretty. I love it. Last year I went to go see a stage play of it. It's so good. The stage play was so good. It not only described the plot, but it was also the history behind it and the writing competition and the motivations of writing it. It's a great book. And I'm actually planning to cover this in another episode, but essentially it is about the Frankenstein family. And basically, Victor wants to create Frankenstein. So he harnesses the power of lightning. He harnesses the power of stitching human parts together. And Frankenstein is born. But when he's born, he basically goes on a rampage, kills a lot of people, and Victor essentially disowns him, and it basically asks the question, who is more evil, the creation or the creator? It's a great book. I definitely recommend it. There's also 2 versions of this. So right now I have the 1818 version of the text. There's also an 1831 version of the text. And it is also called the Modern Prometheus, which relates back to the myth. Here we go. You can see right there, Modern Prometheus. Basically relates back to the myth of Prometheus in Greek mythology, where Prometheus was this guy who wanted to give the power of fire to the humans. The gods were like, absolutely not. And so basically for his punishment, he was tied up to this rock, and a vulture would come, peck at his liver every day. And I got this from another site. This was written by brilliant 18-year-old woman, Mary Shelley, while on holiday with Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Dr. John Polidori amid extensive storms induced by volcanic ash during the so-called year without a summer. Mary Shelley, her name was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin at the time, because her mother was actually Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She was a very good activist for women's rights. She was intrigued by stories of science, such as galvanism, which she would have heard through her father's scientists' friends. And her original intent was to actually create work that confronts science as a way to create life. Therefore, technically, it is the first sci-fi horror novel of its time. And now, that's mainly period 1. Let's move on to period 2. This was written by Moise Mahawate. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But it covers 19th century horror. So this stems off from the end of what we just talked about. So it goes from 1820 to 1880. So officially during this period, there was no, in quote, horror literature in the 19th century, as it was not identified as a popular genre or a literary concept of its time. But as the book states, horror begins with medical terminology, such as John Mason Goode's The Study of Medicine in 1822 uses the words to describe a tropical fever, and I quote from the book. The first attack generally commenced with a horror, but the subsequent paroxysms, though often beginning with the sense of cold, were chiefly without horror. We also see Victorian horror come into this, and Victorian horror's rise, and therefore it becomes a subgenre in a sense as it depicts fear of the afflicted body, which is more specifically present of an unstable body as is medically inscrutable and uncomfortable. We also see the rise of medical and pseudoscientific epistemologies leading to the body becoming a source of horror. I also have another quote from the book here. It is a body dismantled, in pain, dead, or even undead. It is a body that at times wants to be cannibalized, or one that is itself snatched and cannibalized by forces around it. The eating of human flesh is an extensive metaphor in this period, and used even before the popular awareness of evolutionary theories and the accompanying fear of atavism. We also see this Gothic revival in the 1820s as the middle class wanted to read fiction about their changing society. And we also see more books come in. So we see Samuel Warren's Passages from a Diary of a Late Physician from 1830 to 1837. It is considered a medical casebook horror, so it is written as entries of patients. So it describes physical afflictions of patients and their deaths. For example, one of the entries talks about a patient and its schizophrenia. And I quote from the book as well. Warren's influence can be seen throughout the 19th century as doctors started publishing their casebooks and memoirs from a popular readership, reporting particularly on the horrors of sexual ill health. We also see Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde come in, which is written by Robert Louis Stevenson, and it basically deals with split identities and bodily control. And we also see later in that period, domestic and psychological realisms begin to encroach on what remains of Gothic conventions. That is also quoted. In 1860, I quote from the book again, Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White ends with the protagonist, Walter Hartwright, walking at night up the Hampstead Road, back toward London. Suddenly, he narrates, in one moment, every drop of blood in my body was brought to a stop by the touch of a hand, laid lightly and suddenly on my shoulder from behind me. So we also see psychological realism, like I said, domestic realism, but also the supernatural effects begins to rise. We also see the spread of magazine culture. So horror begins to spread rapidly through magazines, which also, this also causes Victorian sensationalism. So supernatural horror also rises in Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is getting a movie release that just came out. Okay, I want to go watch it so bad. It looks so good. It came out the 6th of February. and I haven't read it. I've heard it's really good though, like the book too. And the book was actually meant to serve as a warning of true evil. However, the true Victorian vampire was created by James Rimmer's Lord Francis Varney, which also created the trope of vampires stalking the maidens from the windows. And that concludes period 2. And I'm actually planning this to do in multiple takes, so I'm sorry if this cuts out a few times. It's going to be more like a video, so I will get back to you. All right, we're back. Hi, hello. Now we're going to talk about period 3 of our history of horror literature, which is considered the transition into modern horror according to the book. And this section was written by Roger Luckhurst, and it deals with the subjects from 1880 to 1932. So during the start of this, we have a Victorian revival in Britain for consolidation of the genre in film and fiction in America. And during this, we have The Three Impostors from Arthur Machen in the British Decadent movement, and it becomes published. So this book actually contains chilling stories told to 2 investigators, as it is a story anthology. And the Decadent movement in general consisted of writers that mainly wanted to set art free from materialism of modern society. However, the book was deemed too gruesome and should have been more restrained, and Machen continued to write about fleeing to other planes of existence. It was deemed a master of weird fiction by H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft's another big author that will come up later. And Luckhurst states, I want to propose that Machen's fiction can be taken as representative of a crucial transition from 18th century Gothic to 20th century horror. We can use Machen as a portal into the other fiction being produced at the time to make this case. And in addition, in the 1880s, print culture expands, and we have the expansion of a more literate population. And also, because of this, we have a slick versus pulp journal emerging, and the journals were named based on the paper quality, slick and pulp. So pulp is based on Frank Muncie Ergosy in 1896, and in the 1930s it was sold in the tens of millions, and that part of horror was called shutter pulps because it was on pulp paper. And the popularity of short stories skyrocketed, including Jekyll and Hyde, but the horrors depicted in these stories were actually considered crude. And we also have a separation of high and low literature, which is low to sublime and high to an art form. We also see the publication of Dracula, like I said, by Bram Stoker, and it gained Stoker major backlash, and it was fostered by commercial conditions in society. And also, Machen's function started on this side of the divide. The second way, Luckhurst states, is that the Victorian era of secularization, which is the shifting of authority to the sciences. And he states the second avenue for thinking through the distinction of Gothic and horror is this. So we have the first wave of this is fear associated with moral sin and transgression. And he states it can be found in formations that emerge from mass movements and beliefs like spiritualism. So this actually spread fast from New England in 1848, and it claimed to use science to, in quote, prove existence of spirit after death. And because of this, we also see a occult revival in which mystic groups who wanted to unlock hermetic tradition occurred, flushing theology with modern sciences. We also see Victorian Gothic, also containing men involved in the sciences. So like inside and out Christian formulas, like I mentioned before, Jekyll and Hyde. He also states that the biggest impact on literature of the tension between traditional and scientific authority was felt in the ghost story, which became ambivalently physical at the end of the century. The ghost story occupied the liminal territory between the new psychological, occultism, magic, and physical researches. And a great example of this, he states, is Vernon Lee's Hauntings. We also see the detective trend as well in Sheridan Le Fanu's Dr. Hesselius. And we also see the rise of biology and biological themes, which is stemmed from Darwin's On the Origins of Man by Means of Natural Selection and The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And in these books, Darwin proposes the theory of natural selection, and he also proposes that the human biological form is tied to a plastic future and an animal past, meaning that we are a very malleable species. And malleability is shown in Arthur Conan Doyle's, who also wrote the whole Sherlock Holmes series, The Hounds of Baskerville, and in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. And also, the obsession with biology comes in the form of what we consider slime. And He also quotes, in Machen's novel The Black Sea, the boy's reversion is signaled by trails of sticky matter and ooze. And this is also from him. The traveler feels his face brushed at night by horrible pulps and dreams of tentacles. The touch of the Morlocks is always worse than seeing these bleached, obscene, nocturnal things. Perhaps the English writer most consistently obsessed with slime was William Hope Hodgson. A large number of his seafaring tales involved encounters with disgusting lakes of ooze. In The Derelict, which was published in 1912, for example, the narrator's ship encounters an abandoned wreck entirely swallowed in some kind of spirating jelly growth, carrying a queer, sickly, heavy odor with it that somehow frightened me strangely. It is only once that Captain and his team have run into the ooze that they realize it is alive and hungry to absorb them as well. And this period officially ends with the new term horror, plus many movie adaptations, with the 1931 and 1932 marking the beginning of horror films in Hollywood. And to cap this off for now, we are going to talk about the rise of the psycho killer, which was from 1932, where this ended, to 1971. And this section was written by Bernice M. Murphy. So the short story The Lottery by Shirley Jackson is published and is actually inspired by an actual stoning of Tessie Hutchinson in 1948. So The Lottery is basically where in this town names are picked from a hat, and whoever names is picked, they get stoned to death. And this actually marked the beginning of complex fiction and a contradictory spirit after World War II occurs. Horrors that arose from everyday conditions also took charge in the 1950s. And I quote from Bernice M. Murphy. Many of the genre's classic monsters in stereotypical settings were made over in order to reflect this newfound appetite for psychological and situational realism. Now, at this time, horror is still a small genre, but many new writers arise, which is pioneered by Ray Bradbury, also the author of Fahrenheit 451, Richard Mason, Shirley Jackson in the 1940s and the 1950s, and her books were mainly rooted in real-world anxiety. We also see Bradbury's horror stories in Dark Carnival and The October Country foreshadowed his successor's works. And in this time, the lines between horror, sci-fi, and fantasy are not as distinct as they are today. And these writers also incorporated elements from other genres into their own work. For example, The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney, and I quote, epitomized the horror of creeping dehumanization and political and cultural conformity that many contemporary thinkers saw as being a hallmark to the post-war U.S. At this time, horror comics also arose, primarily from the EC group led by William Gaines. For example, Seduction of the Innocent by Dr. Frederick Werdum, and it helped to crusade against horror comics, and it adopted a self-censorship code to help stop its popularity. We also see the repetition of themes and topics in these media, such as paranoia, subversion of typical ideas, suspicion towards women and female sexuality as a whole, and intrusion of the irrational. Essentially, now we see the apocalyptic setting risings in I Am Legend to create the modern zombie. And I quote again, one of the most interesting developments in post-war horror was the way in which hackneyed old tropes, themes, and settings were reconfigured in order to make them relevant for a post-atomic, post-psychoanalytic age. And now in the late 1940s to early 1970s, writers updated the genre conventions that tested our latent and not so latent psychological and symbolic intent. For example, Conjure Wife is published in 1953 and established the witch in the contemporary setting and established witches as a whole as a female power and an unease to males. And Finney also established the fantasy subgenre, of sword and sorcery. Another example, we also see the publication of Werewolves by Jack Williamson's Darker Than You Think, 1948. And I quote again, the story features a premise that would in later years be replicated in countless urban fantasy novels. A secret and ancient race of werewolves exists alongside and an intermittent battle with humanity. We also see the haunted house subgenre also arise, and examples of this would be Mason's A Stir of Echoes and Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, which also got turned into a movie. And specifically, we're going to focus on The Haunting of Hill House. So the main plot of The Haunting of Hill House is we follow this woman named Eleanor Vance, and she's the resident of this house, and she tries to determine throughout the book whether it's haunted or not as a part of as she is part of a small group of paranormal investigators. Now, Mason also uses this in his 1971 work, Hell House. Supernatural elements also become part of psychological realism through Robert Ackman. He wrote Sub Rosa's Strange Tales in 1968. But however, in the mid-1930s to early 1970s, this is dominated by Dennis Wheatley as his interest in the occult shines through his work. We also see the prominence of satanic themes. Yay! Anyways, it started in Ira Levin's 1976 novel Rosemary's Baby, which is now a movie, and I know it's become very popular. And it helped mass market horror fiction officially take off. So the plot in general of the book is this. Rosemary Woodhouse moves into an apartment with her husband Guy, and when she becomes pregnant, she is convinced her neighbors are plotting to harm the child. And it grounds paranoia into everyday life situations. We also see the evil child trope, which also plays into Rosemary's Baby, where she thinks this baby is evil. But also, Ray Bradbury had similar themes in his 1942 work, The Small Assassin. It is also involved in Mason's Born of Man and Woman in 1950, and it is involved in Charles Beaumont's 1957 Mrs. Jezebel. However, the most famous that uses this is William March's The Bad Seed in 1954, where a mother becomes convinced her daughter is not normal, as the daughter is feared and a classmate of the child mysteriously dies. We also see Lord of the Flies come. I swear I had a copy of it. I guess not. Oh no, here. Yay! This is the, I guess, original cover. It's retro. I've yet to read it, but I want to read it so bad. So the basic plot of this is a group of private school boys basically crash on an island, and they want to create their own society, and at first they're all on board, but then they just start killing each other. So it is a battle between savagery and civilization. It really roots that evil can be anywhere. We also see John Winter's The Midwich Cuckoos in 1957, in which people who populate a village are dominated by aliens. And we also see The Exorcist come into this, which is also a very, very popular movie. And these tropes are used recurrently in 1970s horror. And finally, we get The Rise of the Psycho Killer, which features protagonists whose behavior is a result of aberration, and it reflects attitudes towards mental illness changed in the post-war era, as well as the rise of new drugs and high-profile scandals during this. We also see the rise of the mental state breakdown, as in Psycho, in Mason's short fiction, especially in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet in 1961. Nazi concentration camps made readers understand Norman Bates a bit better, who was the main killer in Psycho. Shirley Jackson also does this in her novels, and Beaumont does as well. But the most notable work was actually Psycho by Robert Bloch. This was a very famous movie that was, I really want to say 1950s. I'm not sure the exact date. But it helped establish the deranged serial killer figure who would appear many times in later work. It is a staple trope now, especially in horror movies, especially in slashers. It's a big thing. It is also considered to be one of the decade's most upsetting true crimes and establishes the blueprint for other psycho killer novels. It actually helped inspire Silence of the Lambs and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, both movies, in later years. We also see horror fiction beginning to enter the literary and publishing mainstream during the post-war era because it had increasingly begun to reflect the myriad anxieties found in everyday life, and that is a quote. All right, that is the end of episode 1. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'm sorry if I speak fast. That's just how I am. Keep a lookout for episode 2, part 2 of this. It's going to be much shorter. We actually covered 2/3 of the content, which is great. Now we just have periods 4 and periods 5. A quick note, this book only goes up until 2016, so it's not as recent as it should be, but it's still a great deep dive into the genre in general. All right, bye guys. Love you guys.